So, I'm recording this podcast on Saturday morning, and most of what I'm going to describe occurred yesterday. But actually, a lot of what occurred that I'm going to describe was more than, 13 years ago, some of it more than 17 years ago. Some of it well more than that, actually. So, I'm going to outline a lot of stuff here, some of which may be new information. Some background to this, my listener Spencer, who has appeared on My Rules Better, and is a very keen listener to long funk recordings as well, subscribe to the Biota podcast, which is a podcast that I am probably slowly restarting with the view that it has a fraction of the numbers of folks at Model Rail Radio listeners, so smaller than Model Rail Radio, but Model Rail Radio is a podcast that I continue to this day, and I'm not a Model Railroader. While the simulation stuff, I'm still pretty actively involved with in my kind of day-to-day life, and I think there are a number of really pressing questions and discussion points relating to generative AI and the history of generative AI and the history of artificial life and the fact that people need a good grounding in what makes artificial life, neural networks and these kind of things to even start having a discussion associated with generative AI. So, Spencer, listener to this podcast, listener to My Rules Are Better, went to the Biotacast and listened to, I think, one of them. I don't know if he's listened to the Jeffrey podcast, but he listened to the Bruce Damer podcast. And Bruce Damer and I've talked about this briefly in this podcast as best as I can, I don't know. Biota was a project that I put about 9 years of my life into, and then Bruce Damer cancelled Biota. And I realized through that period of time I was leaving the Bay Area, I was about to have my daughters and a series of things. It just made sense that Bruce and I kind of parted ways, and I stopped having an administrative responsibility of the Biota website. But I realized that the podcast still had an audience, and I realized that the podcast was still important, and I realized with that audience, some of these people, mysteriously maybe, might be people that would be interesting to talk to in years' time, ongoing years, including the prior participants in the podcast. So I was in this strange position where I restarted the podcast. I've restarted with 2 conversations. I've got a third coming up. I was going to have a fourth with a gentleman called Steve Grant, which is another story which I won't digress too much in here. I think I gave some degree of candor to the email that Spencer was on with the other participants, just about the situation with Steve Grant for another time. So anyway, Spencer, I don't know, hadn't heard Bruce Damer before, so he didn't know about Bruce Damer's raps and this discussion of psychedelia and various other things. And I was friends with a long period of time with Bruce Damer. In fact, when he got his PhD, I said to him, now's actually the time you can probably come out with regards to your other interests in psychedelia and things like that. Fundamentally psychedelics, fundamentally ayahuasca, going into the jungle and consuming ayahuasca. Now, I personally have a kind of not necessarily arm's length view of the psychedelic community because they were very welcoming to me, and I've recorded a few psychedelic salon podcasts, including one with Bruce Damer and one with Heron Stone. And if you want another podcast of great volume of mine to listen to, I recommend Stone Ape when you're in the right mood. But it's slightly different than the Biota podcast because the Biota podcast is mainly me acting as an interviewer, but also interjecting or injecting some of my own ideas in the process of doing the interview, which I certainly did very successfully with, or at least relatively successfully with Jeffrey Ventrella. Not so much with Bruce Damer, but we could return more with Bruce Damer because my view is I'll record another podcast with him in at least the next 6 to 8 weeks, let's say. Let's put that in the sand as a possibility. And I'm looking forward to talking with Tim Taylor in a couple of weeks' time. So the Biota podcast is getting new energy, but it's also 17 years worth of audio going back way back in the day. And I realized also that I have this Ape Reality podcast, which is a podcast that's now so totally out of date, but obviously was still being recorded up until 2011. So I realized that, I showed Spence a video of me and my wife at Bruce Damer's place going through the Timothy Leary archive. If you have any interest in psychedelia, the Timothy Leary archive is fascinating. I mean, if you have any interest in psychedelia, Bruce Damer is fascinating. Let me just cut to the chase there. And there was a section in the video where Bruce Damer shows some of Timothy Leary's ashes, or at least the mechanisms that they use to distribute the ashes. Now, I used to have a friend called Douglas Rushkoff, who actually is the reason that I'm in America. He wrote an article on my work back in 1999, I think it was 1999, which got me back to the US very quickly. And I never looked back from that article. I had to do a lot of work, obviously, to stay in the US and then go move to the UK and a bunch of other stuff that I had to do. It was somewhat down to me as well. But Douglas Rushkoff was so welcoming and so interesting and so I don't know, tuned in basically to the stuff that interested me. And obviously I'd read his book Siberia previously, and actually a few of his books prior. So Douglas Rushkoff had framed a lot of my ideas too. I was almost like the child of Douglas Rushkoff with regards to some of these ideas. Now, I remember the last time I emailed Douglas Rushkoff. Who knows if I'll ever hear back from Douglas Rushkoff. He's moved into a completely different sphere. When I saw him with Al Gore, I realized that, yes, I have my sphere, Douglas has his sphere. Douglas still continues to do well-selling books. More power to him. I'm not really part of the Democrat Party uber alles narrative, which certainly plagues a lot of affluent, particularly Caucasians that I know. But yes, anyway. So let's put a peg in Douglas Rushkoff. Who knows if he's going to email me back? But I emailed Douglas Rushkoff, sent him 2 bits of information. Firstly, the Timothy Leary Library video, which I'm not sure if he's seen. And because the Ashes were mentioned in it, and obviously Douglas has a long-standing history with Timothy Leary as well. And I also mentioned Terence McKenna, because Terence McKenna was an interesting person that Douglas had some interaction with, and he framed, although not explicitly, like listening to his audio after, or listening to his talks after the fact, he seemed to be describing things that were very similar to my Noble Ape simulation at a number of times, but he died, I don't know, he died probably a couple of years after I started the simulation, but I had no contact with Terence McKenna. I've just had contact with people, like Bruce Damer, for example, and now Douglas Rushkoff, who had contact with Terence McKenna too. So anyway, I then went back and found some audio from 2011. When Noble Ape turned 15, I went back and tried to find a bunch of luminaries, and I missed out on a bunch of folk who I wanted to talk with but just couldn't track down, but I was able to track down Douglas Rushkoff. So I listened to the first, I don't know, maybe half, maybe 2/3 of the audio, and I thought, oh, this is perfect for a biota podcast, and it just follows on the tails of my conversation with Bruce Damer, even though I had a conversation with Jeffrey in between that. But certainly I thought, Spence and others would get something out of the Douglas Rushkoff audio as well. So I put the Douglas Rushkoff in the biota feed. And I also put a talk from 2012, which if you go to nobleape.com and look at the text there, is basically the talk from 2012 transcribed onto nobleape.com. It's like a footnote to Noble Ape. I'm still an owner of the domain name, but I don't know if I'll be using it anytime in the future. But it's a footnote to what I thought was one of my more interesting intellectual discussions about the simulation with a group of academics, transcribed on nobleape.com and available now in audio back in the biota feed. However, the biota feed, which is a podcast that I've operated for 17 years, wasn't resolving, and a bunch of podcast players wouldn't play all the audio, and I had to go through and actually do the debugging, which I finished at about 2 a.m. today. It's currently 9 a.m. So not a lot of sleep last night, but really just working on adrenaline based on all these connections that I was able to track down and run with. And I sent email and correspondence with a bunch of other folk who may feature in a future Long Funk discussion, but I did want to give some indication of what has actually transpired on my end. So anyway, this is a longer than normal Long Funk, but I did want to just put it out there, and hopefully, I'm sure I've made various word problems, so I'm going to do a quick edit on this and just try to get it out. But if you do need additional Barbelate audio, certainly I would recommend biotacast.org. Subscribe to that podcast. There are actually it's so old, there are 2 different podcast feeds. And I found the old one again last night while I was trying to do the debugging, and it's stopped a few years ago, so I just updated it with the most recent podcast feed. So who knows if there'll be a group of listeners that come to it now, but it's an interesting podcast now as a group of listeners. So Biotacast, if you're interested in one Barbelate podcast, and if you're interested in another Barbelate podcast, I'm saying this specifically to Spence, but others who might be listening in, Stone Ape is a good example, which is, I think, nobleape.com/stone. And that is audio that I stopped in 2016, so it's considerably more contemporary and actually covers my move to the Bay Area, which the Biota audio didn't cover. So anyway, if you're interested in more Barbelate audio, and I have to really say thank you so much to Spencer here, because I've been missing conversations with him. I logged into Discord, just saw that he'd heard the Bruce Damer Biota conversation, and then provided him the link to the Timothy Leary archive, which is a video of Bruce, my wife and I, going through Timothy Leary's books, and then just reinvigorated me contacting Bruce and saying maybe we should restart this podcast. So a bunch of stuff, thanks to Spence, and hopefully this has made coherent sense. I now have to edit it. Tom Barber in Las Vegas, Nevada, signing out.